All right, ladies and gents, welcome and happy Monday. I hope your weekend went really well, that it was restful or productive, or you got to, blow off some steam. Um, as I said last week, I am now in Mexico, enjoying some nice 84-degree weather. I'm recording this video at about 2:30 on last Friday, so I'm talking to you from the past. So just a reminder, I will be gone all week. Mr. Henderson will be your sub, so make sure you treat him with the same respect that you treat me. Well, more respect than you treat me. Um, but just a quick piece of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hop right into the lecture. So we are going to move on to Unit 5 this week, and this will be a very typical week for you guys. So we'll have the lecture today, tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. You guys will have reading activities, and then Friday you will have the Unit 5 quiz. The quiz study guide should be up on Google Classroom, and the chapter reading guide should be up as well. That chapter reading guide will be due Friday. So just like normal, your activities and assignments should pop up on Google Classroom when you do them. If we do miss a day, because I know we're supposed to get some weather this week, if we do miss a day of class, we are going to cancel that day's lesson, and then the following day we will do the normally scheduled lesson for that day. So say we get class canceled on Wednesday, we will just cancel that Wednesday lesson, and on Thursday you'll just do the regular scheduled lesson for that Thursday. So all right, so let's go ahead and get started with this lecture. First slide. So last week in Unit 4, we were talking about the Wisconsin's experience in the Civil War, and this was an interesting time period in Wisconsin because it had come right after the formation of Wisconsin as a state. So Wisconsin forms or gets incorporated as a state in 1848, and then just a handful of years later, it is dealing with the sectional crisis that is going to lead us into the Civil War. So Wisconsin's experience with the Civil War was very much one of, we were very, very much an anti-slavery state. So it was interesting, or an interesting piece of Wisconsin history, how we are the part that we play in the Civil War in terms of being anti-slavery, in terms of resisting the Fugitive Slave Act, in terms of being the birthplace of the Republican Party. So that's there, then, and done. So with the Civil War done, the next period that we're going to move into here in Unit 5 is a unit called Piney Woods and Green Pastures. So this is going to deal with Wisconsin culture and the economy in kind of the 3 decades after the Civil War. So we're going to be roughly from 1865 until the year 1900. So that's the time frame we're looking at. And without further ado, let's pop into the first slide. Okay, so the first slide that we're going to talk about, the first topic in this unit, is the lumber period. And of course, the lumber period refers to the piney woods part of the title of this unit. And starting in the 1840s, but really accelerating after the Civil War, the lumber industry is going to become the dominant industry in Wisconsin, replacing the fur trade and the mining industry as the primary employer and the primary economic driver in the state of Wisconsin. And this is going to be especially true in the northern part of the state. So pretty much everything from central Wisconsin on up is really going to be taken over by the lumber industry. So in the late 1800s, we call this the lumber period in Wisconsin history. So as you may or may not know, or remember from when we talked about this in our geography unit, the northern part of Wisconsin is known for having a little bit sandier soil. So it's not good for agriculture. However, it does have plenty of rivers and streams, and it has vast areas of pine woodland, right? So some of the largest collections of white pine take place right in Wisconsin, and especially in northern Wisconsin in the Chippewa Valley. So Wisconsin, geographically and sort of with our land resources, we are going to be a really prime location for lumbering. Now, one of the big reasons that lumbering starts to emerge at an industry at this time is because by the late 1800s, populations are booming in the Midwest especially. And because populations are going up and up and up, housing, or the need for housing is going up and up and up. So with the increased demand for housing comes the demand for a cheap building material for houses. And of course, that's wood, and white pine in particular. So the forests in the white pine forests in Wisconsin are going to provide the timber for these wood frame houses that are going to become a staple in settling the Midwest cities. So most of the lumbering happens in northern Wisconsin, like I said, where there are great groves of white pine especially, and it's the major tree that gets logged as part of the lumber industry. It's by some estimates the Chippewa Valley forest alone holds something like I forget what your textbook says, something like a sixth of all white pine lumber between between the Atlantic Ocean and the Rocky Mountains. So it's just massive white pine forests here in Wisconsin. So like I said, really, really prime location for the lumber industry. Now, the lumber industry, logging, how did this work? So lumbering was typically a one-season activity. So lumbering typically happened in the winter in Wisconsin, kind of starting in really late fall when you get the snowfalls and going through spring just after the spring thaw. So it was probably about a third of the year was when the lumbering activities actually took place. And typically lumbering was done with small groups or small camps of around 20 people. And each of these camps, or each of the people in these camps would have sort of a defined specialty role. So some people would be in charge of going out and scouting new areas to cut down. Some people would be your actual sawyers, right? So the people who would cut down the trees. Some people would be your teamsters, or the people that were in charge of using horse-drawn carriages to transport the logs from place to place. And still others, you would have your foreman, you would have your cookie, right? So the cook for the camp. So the camps were typically pretty small, but each person had a sort of defined role within this camp. So when a grove of white pine was identified to be cut down, these logs were cut down, right, typically in pairs of people. And the reason that you primarily log in winter is that once these trees are cut down, the easiest way to transport these trees is to actually use an ice road, right? So they will create a man-made sort of ice road that they can then drag the logs across, because ice is much less friction than just the plain old ground. So they would use these ice roads to drag the logs from where they are cut in the pine groves to the rivers, which takes us to the next stage of the logging process. So these logs that are cut down all throughout the winter are piled up next to the rivers, okay, the closest river that they can get to. And when the spring thaw starts to come, these logs are dumped into the river, and they follow the rivers downstream until they come to the sawmill, right? So a little bit further downstream, usually in cities like Black River Falls or Chippewa Falls or La Crosse, become known for having these sawmills in them. These millions and millions and millions of board feet of lumber will all start flowing downstream at the same time right after the spring thaw. So you can kind of imagine looking at these streams and just seeing, just flotillas of logs piling past them. Now, the most dangerous part of the logging process was what you can kind of see on the picture of this slide. Sometimes so many logs would be floating down the rivers in Wisconsin that they would get jammed up. And so a log jam was kind of the most dangerous part of this logging process, because the only way to break up this log jam was to have people actually climb out on these logs in the middle of the river and use poles to try and break apart the jam. And of course, these logs, very easy to slip under, to lose your balance, to get crushed. And especially once you get that jam going, that the logs are just going to kind of come forward, and so it's very easy to get crushed and die. So these river rats is what they call them. These people who will break apart the jams. That's definitely the most dangerous part, or the most dangerous occupation in the logging industry. So the logging industry continues for many decades in Wisconsin, and the more you log, the more areas of Wisconsin start to become very logged over. And so, of course, these loggers logged over these areas without much concern for sustainability. So oftentimes they would kind of clear cut these forests, leave tons of sawdust, leave kind of the stumps right where they are. And so, of course, when the weather got very dry, this created really potent conditions for fires. So the best known fire was the Peshtigo fire, which happens in 1861, which is to date the deadliest fire in American history. Some 2,000 people die as a result of this Peshtigo fire. So the lumber period created fantastic wealth in Wisconsin, especially for the people who owned these lumber companies or operated these sawmills, but came with dangers especially as well. So that's the logging industry. So at the same time that the lumber industry is becoming the primary economic driver in northern Wisconsin, agriculture is starting to replace mining in the southern part of the state. So this agriculture is going to develop as the most important industry of the southern part of Wisconsin by the Civil War. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, that when the miners left, right, when many of the miners left to go to the more productive mineral ranges in Minnesota and out west, most of them left, but the ones who stayed, the most logical use for land that had previously been used for mining was, of course, farming. So the first group of farmers that you get coming to Wisconsin to farm this area were your Yankees, right? Your people moving from places like New York and New England. And these Yankees would come into Wisconsin, and they were primarily farming wheat. And the reason that they grow wheat, at least initially, is because wheat is a very resilient crop. It's a very easy crop to get off the ground, so you can very quickly sort of clear some land, plant a wheat crop. You don't need to fertilize it, really. So it's a very low maintenance crop, and you can grow, it grows really quickly. So sometimes these Yankee farmers could grow multiple crops of wheat in a given year. So wheat was really easy to grow for these Yankee farmers that were coming in sort of in the early, like the 1840s and 1850s. Now, as we've already talked about, kind of beginning in the 1840s and moving into the 1850s, the source of immigration in Wisconsin starts to change. So it starts to change from being a Yankee source primarily to being a European source, so like a Scandinavian, German, Norwegian, Irish sort of source. So one effect that this is going to have, I should say, is that the using wheat, or having wheat as the main crop, is gradually going to, or farmers are gradually going to start to move away from using wheat as the main crop. And there are a few reasons for this. First is that farmers, the Yankee farmers especially, tended to be very amateurish and very careless in the way that they would farm. So they would plant lots of crops of wheat. They wouldn't take care of the soil. They wouldn't rotate their crops. And so after several generations of using pretty exclusive wheat crops, the soil was in pretty bad shape, kind of by like the Civil War, after the Civil War. So these Yankee farmers who didn't want to work very hard, they kind of wanted this quick and easy crop. When their wheat crops started to fail as a result of these poor farming practices, they largely moved on. And as this new group of immigrants, the Germans and the Norwegians and the Europeans came in, they started to replace the Yankee wheat farming with some more sustainable farming methods. So doing things like rotating crops, using manure, lacing the fields with lime to use as fertilizer. So by the time we get after the Civil War and kind of into the late 1800s, Wisconsin starts transitioning away from being solely a wheat growing state. So another reason that you see that Wisconsin start to transition away from wheat growing state is that with the McCormick reaper and the case thresher, you see increasing mechanization in farms as well. So the farms become less of a sort of an individual family-run type affair, and they start to become larger. They start to be more corporate, and so because the more scale and the more mechanization these farms can employ, the less economical it becomes for your small family-owned farms, which is why the Yankees move on to other areas, and Wisconsin starts looking to different types of farming as a result. So just want to make sure. Okay, so by the later 1800s, the wheat industry starts to get replaced with the dairying industry, and one of the big influences behind the switch to dairy was actually the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was looking at the problems created by the over-farming of wheat and trying to figure out smarter ways to use that land. And of course, dairying is a very sort of perpetuating or very sustainable use of farmland. So the University of Wisconsin-Madison starts trying to talk to these different German immigrants and the remaining Yankee immigrants and trying to influence them to switch from wheat farming to dairy farming to preserve the land. So this starts to happen towards the end of the 1800s. And so gradually more and more people in Wisconsin are going to start to take up dairy farming. But at least initially, dairy farming was a very non-regulated process, and the quality of the milk and the milk fat that was being put out was not very strong. And so the governor at the time, William Dempster Horde, is going to push Wisconsinites to join this Wisconsin Dairymen's Association. And this association is going to serve as a centralizing association and marketplace and sort of research coalition for the dairy industry here in Wisconsin. And as a result of the Dairymen's Association and the pooling of resources, the quality of dairy products in Wisconsin is going to be much higher. And so this is going to boost productivity, but it's going to make farmers kind of clean up their act a little bit. So through the influence of University of Wisconsin-Madison and the state government here in Wisconsin, they sort of centralize and raise the quality of the products of dairy farming here in the state. So another industry that you're going to see thrive and really grow in Wisconsin in the late 1800s is the railroad industry. And there's going to be really close ties and a really close cause and effect relationship between the growth of the railroads and several of the industries that we've already talked about before, especially the dairy and the logging industry. So, of course, the railroads in the 1800s are going to be the best way to get back and forth from point A to point B. And so in the later 1800s especially, you're going to see an explosion in the density and the mileage of railroad trackage. And most towns of probably about 500 people or more in Wisconsin are going to become linked to the railroad system in some way, shape, or form. And the railroad system is also going to start linking itself to the bigger cities in the national economy, right? So Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Chicago, all of these areas are going to start to link to the Wisconsin railroad system. Now, one of the drivers of the railroad system here in the state of Wisconsin was going to be that it was the best way to transport the goods that were being produced by the main economies here in the state. So, of course, when we cut down the logs or when we grow our dairy products, the only way to make money off those economic activities is by getting those resources, those products, to market. And of course, it's going to be the railroads that fulfill this function of transporting these products to market. So as you see the dairy and the flour and the logging industry grow in Wisconsin, you're going to see a corresponding growth in the railroad industry as well, and vice versa. As the railroads grow, you're going to see more of those industries too. So it's a very symbiotic relationship between the industries in Wisconsin and the growth of the railroads. Now, several different inventions are going to be embraced by the railroads here in Wisconsin that are going to further contribute to the rise of the industries here in the state. And probably the most notable ones was the adoption of the refrigerator car by Augustus Swift of the Chicago meat packing plant in the mid-1800s. So Augustus Swift is a meat packer in Chicago, and he is going to pioneer the use of a refrigerated railroad car that could keep meat fresh longer in getting it to market. And Wisconsin and the dairy industry here in the state, again influenced by our friend William Dempster Horde, right, who is this guy in the picture before, who is kind of the centralizing force behind the dairy industry. He's going to take a look at the meatpacking industry using these refrigerator cars and say, hey, this would be really useful for the dairy industry in the state as well. So the Wisconsin dairy industry adopts the use of these refrigerator cars, and that makes it possible for Wisconsin dairy producers to sell their milk all over the country, not just within a few days radius of the state. So this is going to expand the market for the dairy industry and further drive growth in this sector. Now, the railroads in Wisconsin were often financed by the government giving or donating public land to railroad companies who would then go and sell this public land for a huge profit. Now, this might seem weird because these railroad companies were private entities, right? So why would the government play favorites with these private companies, these railroads, give them land and let them sell that land for a profit? Well, the reason was that the railroads, even though they were privately owned, were seen as almost something like a public utility, right? Like water or electricity. So cities oftentimes needed railroad linkage in order for their economies to flourish. So the state government recognized the necessity of railroads to economic expansion in Wisconsin and provided them with this stimulus of capital, right? This money that they could gain through free land sales. So this was kind of a good thing for people in Wisconsin because giving this land to the railroads to sell really drove expansion in the railroads. However, it was, in addition to a driver of growth, this method of funding the construction of the railroads also drove lots of corruption in the railroad industry too. Individuals like the guy pictured over at the right-hand side of the screen, Alexander Mitchell, would make tons of money off these land sales and then subsequently the railroads that he builds. And unfortunately, the railroads, when built, oftentimes would have very predatory price practices. So especially if there was only one railroad going into a given town, they would jack the prices for that railroad way up. So it was kind of unfortunate that the public was donating land to these private companies to build the railroads, and then these railroads would turn right around and just have predatory price practices towards the public as well. So in the 1870s, you see the emergence of organizations called the Grange. And the Grange were cooperative organizations of farmers. And it happens here in Wisconsin, but also across the country because these actions by the railroads were widespread. They didn't just happen here in Wisconsin. But you see the emergence of these Grange associations. And these farmer associations work together to get politicians elected who agree to sort of combat the malpractice by the railroads and to pass rates that limit the corrupt practice of railroad rate setting. And so here in Wisconsin, that emerges as something called the Potter Law in 1874, which set up a schedule, basically a cap on the rates that railroads could charge for people. And it also set up a commission that would investigate the economics of railroad rate setting. And if this commission determined that the railroads were being predatory in their price setting practices, they could sort of crack down on this railroad and punish them. Unfortunately, though, This legislation was kind of poorly written and it was really hard to enforce. So it wound up being very ineffective, and the railroads basically just went right ahead and charged whatever rates they wanted to. So this Alexander Mitchell over on the right hand side built up a huge network of railroads in Wisconsin, built up a massive fortune, and did so largely through very corrupt and very exploitative practices. Okay, so the railroad companies and the fact that these railroad companies had grown so big and so financially powerful and had kind of made easy use of these corrupt practices. The railroad companies weren't the only economic entities doing things like this. Um, this period in American history, the late 1800s, is something that we call the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is going to be, and you may remember this from U.S. history, but the Gilded Age, for something to be gilded, it means that it's typically a cheaper quality material that is enclosed in a thin layer of higher quality material. So you oftentimes see this with like jewelry, where you'll have a cheaper metal that will be covered with like a gold leaf or gold, a small layer of gold. And when we do that, we say that something is gilded. So when referring to this period of politics, when we call it the Gilded Age, what we say is that if you look at the surface level, you'll see this really big economic expansion and the growth in the size of corporations and fabulous wealth generation. But when you look underneath the surface a little bit, things don't look so rosy, that these big companies are becoming big through corrupt practices, and they are exploiting sort of the common everyday people. So the railroads weren't the only type of economic institution doing this. So across the United States in the late 1800s, in the Gilded Age, Americans were having to cope with these issues of economic growth, but in a corrupt way. So Wisconsin is no different. Wisconsin during the late 1800s was very much controlled by large corporations, and especially the owners of these large corporations. Um, these people who established these big personal fortunes were able to exercise outsized control on the Wisconsin political system by making use of their money and their economic power. And oftentimes what these big corporate tycoons would do is they would use their money and their power to establish something called a political machine. So once these gentlemen, such as Philetus Sawyer, who was a lumber millionaire, and he's the upper picture on this slide. And then our railroad friend from back on the previous slide, Alexander Mitchell. These guys would use their personal fortunes to get themselves into a position of political power. And then they would use something called patronage to keep their positions of political power. And patronage was the ability of politicians, so governors and senators, to hand out government jobs to people who support them politically. So these people who are able to use their personal fortunes, get themselves into a place of political power, were then able to sort of pick and choose the politicians that they wanted by giving them the jobs that they wanted. So this arrangement was called a political machine, and it was a political organization that sort of had a stranglehold on the politics of Wisconsin in the late 1800s. So Philetus Sawyer, the lumber billionaire, was your Republican boss, right, of these political machines. And the Democratic political machine was controlled by our railroad guy, Alexander Mitchell. So the post office, kind of funnily enough, was central to the strength of the political machines, because at this point the governments were still relatively small, right? Most of the jobs in government happened in the post office as postmasters and that sort of thing. So most of these jobs, these patronage jobs that the government would give out, were in the form of post office jobs. So if you could control the government, you could control the post office, you could control patronage, which means through your political machine you could control state politics. Now, so that was the state of politics in Wisconsin during the late 1800s, was controlled by these organizations, these political machines. Perhaps the biggest crisis that you're going to get in Wisconsin politics during this period is going to happen in 1889 with the passage of something called the Bennett Law. And the Bennett Law is going to be passed by Governor William Dempster Hord, which, if you think back, William Dempster Hord was the primary guy behind the dairy industry. Okay, so sorry about that, class. Got minor interruption by the end of the day here. So hopping right back into this, the Bennett Law was a law that was passed under Republican Governor William Dempster Hord, and William Dempster Hord was the same guy who was behind lots of the Wisconsin Dairymen's Association. And really trying to push the change in Wisconsin agriculture from wheat to dairy. Now, one of the frustrations that Dempster Hord had through his work with the Dairymen's Association, that the Dairymen's Association would publish lots of studies and information out for the farmers in Wisconsin. But one of the struggles that he ran into over and over again was the fact that many American immigrants in Wisconsin did not speak English. So Wisconsin had a pretty widespread system of public education. So most of the people living in Wisconsin, especially kids, got a public school education. But there was also a very strong, very well-attended parochial school system as well. So private schools not associated with the public schools. And most of these parochial schools were German language schools. So they taught German as the primary language. So a lot of immigrants, especially immigrant farmers in Wisconsin, didn't speak English whatsoever. They spoke German. So William Dempster Hord, through his experience with this, had problems with the Germans speaking German and not English. So what the Bennett Law did was attempt to mandate English instruction in all schools, even the parochial schools. And this triggered a massive backlash by Wisconsin's really substantial immigrant population and was a political disaster for the Republicans during that administration. Now, getting into the 1890s, we have this is kind of one of our turning point episodes, right? This event is really going to constitute a turning point in Wisconsin history. And in the 1890s, the Wisconsin state government is going to a corrupt scheme for the Wisconsin state government is going to be uncovered. And this corrupt scheme went like this. The Wisconsin government, with the money that the government had, right, the funds that come in taxes, when that money came in taxes to the state government kept them in a series of private banks, right? There was no sort of Bank of Wisconsin. And these private banks were called pet banks. And the money that got deposited, the state money that got deposited in these private banks, would be used by private banks to loan out to other businesses. So these private banks made quite a bit of money on the state money that was residing in these banks. Now, typically, if you're a private citizen and you have money in a bank and that money loans out your deposits and makes money off it, the interest from that, or at least part of the interest, goes back to you. In the case of the state, in these pet banks, though, that money wasn't going back to the state. It was being kept with the bank. And so the interest, the proceeds off the state funds, the state capital in these pet banks, was staying with the banks. And as it turned out, lots of these pet banks were owned wholly or partially by these big corporate titans, your Philetus Sawyers and your Alexander Mitchells. And especially a lot of these banks were held by our friend Philetus Sawyer, who is that picture in the upper part of the screen. So when it gets uncovered a little bit that these banks might be using the proceeds from the Wisconsin state government deposits in these banks, and that money might be enriching banks that were owned by the owners of these political machines, that's a very corrupt process. And this process gets exposed a little bit. And this Philetus Sawyer turns to a young lawyer in Madison by the name of Robert La Follette. And that name should sound familiar. It's the Madison La Follette High School is named after this guy, Robert La Follette. And Philetus Sawyer is going to ask La Follette to sort of make this problem disappear, right? Make it so that it doesn't come out that my banks are sort of skimming state money off the top. And La Follette is going to be extraordinarily offended that he was approached for this, that he was offered a bribe, and that he was being asked to cover up corruption by these Gilded Age Titan politics types. So this is going to kickstart a lifelong political career of La Follette fighting against corrupt politics. And that's what we're going to talk about next unit with the progressives. Take care.